So last time we had started going through Kripke's critique of the description theory of reference as applied to names. We looked at theses 1 and 2. This time we'll continue with thesis 3. So thesis 3 says, if most or a weighted most of the properties that the individual associates with the name are satisfied by one unique object, then that object is the referent of the name. So suppose this person says, I wonder whether Kurt Gödel was an American. And what he believes about Kurt Gödel is that he discovered this really important and interesting theorem in mathematics called the incompleteness theorem, which says this, that no formal system can represent all truths of arithmetic. More specifically, he thinks the theorem can be proved as follows. Now, I'm sort of having that ellipsis there to indicate that this individual beats the circularity condition. So he doesn't just think, oh, Gödel discovered the incompleteness theorem, and the incompleteness theorem was the thing discovered by Gödel. He has a really robust and rich notion of the incompleteness theorem. He could even prove it, okay? He can recount Gödel's proof. So he says, I wonder whether Gödel was American. Well, according to Kripke in this example, Green believes that Gödel uniquely discovered the incompleteness theorem. And that's good. And Green also knows the theorem, so the circularity condition isn't violated. So that's good. And then Kripke asks, despite all that, is it still possible that thesis 3 is false? That is it still possible that most of the properties that Green associates with the name Gödel are satisfied by some particular individual, and yet that individual is not the referent of Gödel when Green uses it? So again, let me put it this way. Green associates some set of properties phi with the name Kurt Gödel. Is it possible that some individual satisfies phi, but is not the referent of Green's uses of Kurt Gödel? And Kripke says that it is, and he asks us to imagine the following scenario. So here we have a piece of wood, and here we have an individual who comes along and announces that he's discovered the proof. He says, I just proved that no formal system can represent every truth of arithmetic, and he has the proof written down on a piece of paper. That, of course, on the paper is not the proof, it's just a bunch of nonsense. Then along comes this guy, Maroon, and Maroon says, you have, eh? And Maroon is an aspiring mathematician who isn't especially creative and has never done anything interesting. So we're going to say Orange was dubbed Schmidt at birth and has been called that since. So when Orange was born, Orange's parents said, I name you Schmidt. And everyone since has called Orange Schmidt. And the person in Maroon was dubbed Gödel at birth and has been called that since. So when the person was born, the parents said, I name you Gödel, and everyone's called Maroon that since. Okay, so intuitively, we'd want to say that Maroon is Gödel and Orange is Schmidt. Now, the story continues. Kripke says, suppose that our Maroon here, the person who has traditionally been called Gödel, kills the person who has been called Schmidt, kills Orange and steals the proof, and then decides to pass it off as his own work. Okay? He's smart enough to understand that he's an aspiring mathematician. He just wasn't creative enough to create it. And let's suppose that Maroon's plan is entirely successful. He passes off the theorem as his own, he gets all the credit, and no one ever knows much about Orange except that Orange was found dead on the road one day. Maroon again was dubbed Gödel at birth and has been called that since, and once again Orange was dubbed Schmidt at birth and has been called that since. Here's a question. Whom does Gödel refer to in this scenario? That is, ordinary uses of the term Gödel. Let's say the guy on the last slide. His uses of the term Gödel. Which of these two individuals does it refer to? If thesis 3 is true, then that individual's uses of Gödel refer to Orange, not Maroon. Why? Because the description that that person associates with Gödel is the discoverer of the incompleteness theorem. And Orange, of course, is the discoverer of the incompleteness theorem. So suppose that the person on the last slide meets up with Maroon, goes home and says, I met Gödel today. If thesis 3 is true, then when the individual says, I met Gödel today, the individual was wrong. because Gödel in that person's mouth refers to Orange because Orange is the discoverer of the theorem, and being the discoverer of the theorem is the description that that individual associates with the name Gödel. So let's continue with another example. When someone says, does Gödel work at the university? Is Gödel an American? I saw Gödel the other day, and so on. One is always talking about Orange. And when one says, Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem, what one says is true, because Orange proved the theorem and Gödel refers to Orange. And when someone says Gödel stole the theorem and killed Schmidt, what one says is false. Why? Because Gödel refers to Orange, and Orange didn't steal the theorem, and Orange didn't kill Schmidt. But intuitively, Kripke's idea is that's super strange, right? Intuitively, when one says Gödel stole the theorem and killed Schmidt, it comes out true. But in order for that to come out true, the name Gödel has to be referring to Maroon. So here's Kripke. He says, no way. He thinks that Gödel refers to Maroon, not Orange. So when you say, does Gödel work at the university? Is Gödel a good American? I saw Gödel the other day, and so on, you're talking about Maroon. And when you say Gödel proved the incompleteness theorem, what one says is false, because Orange proved the theorem, and Gödel refers to Maroon. And when someone says Gödel stole the theorem and killed Schmidt, what one says is true, because Gödel refers to Maroon, who did steal the theorem. Here's a longish quote I'll read through. Even worse, misconceptions, of course, occur to the layman. In the previous example, I supposed people to identify Einstein by reference to his work on relativity. Actually, I often used to hear that Einstein's most famous achievement was the invention of the atomic bomb. So when we refer to Einstein, we refer to the inventor of the atomic bomb. But of course, Einstein didn't do that. Columbus was the first man to realize the Earth was round, people say. He was also the first European to land on the Western Hemisphere, people say. Probably none of those things are true, and therefore, according to the description theory of names, when people use the term Columbus, they really refer to some Greek, if they're talking about the roundness of the Earth, or to some Norseman, if they're talking about the discoverer of America. But they don't. I mean, think about it like this. Suppose that the name Columbus really does refer to the way the description theory says, and the description that people associate with the name Columbus is being the first European to land in the Americas. Well, then, when someone says Columbus discovered America, or was the first European to land in the Americas, that's true. And the reason it's true is because of some Norse person. That's really weird. Or suppose we are celebrating Columbus Day, and people say, well, Columbus was responsible for all this horror. We shouldn't be celebrating Columbus Day. What they say is wrong if the description theory is true. Why? Because that Norse person wasn't responsible for all this horror. And when we celebrate Columbus Day, we're celebrating that Norse person. Well, that's really weird, right? That just seems wrong. So it does not seem that if most of the properties are satisfied by a unique object, then that object is the referent of the name. Thesis 3 seems simply to be false. Okay. I'll go through thesis 4, and then we'll leave 5 and 6 for the next segment. So thesis 4 says, if the vote yields no unique object, the name does not refer. And here's a series of quotes from Kripke. He says, really, this case has already been covered before, has been covered in my previous examples. First, the vote may not yield a unique object, as in the case of Cicero or Feynman. Now, we didn't talk about the Cicero case, but take the Feynman case. Was a famous physicist is the only description, say, I associate with Feynman. I can refer to Feynman nonetheless, even though was a famous physicist doesn't pick out anyone uniquely. Similarly, suppose the only description I associate with Cicero is was a famous Roman orator. Well, Cicero isn't the only famous Roman orator, but I can use Cicero to refer to Cicero anyway, so it must be that the demand for a unique referent is false. Secondly, suppose it yields no object, that nothing satisfies most or even any substantial number of the properties. Does that mean the name doesn't refer? No, says Kripke. In the same way you may have false beliefs about a person which may actually be true of someone else, so you may have false beliefs which are true about absolutely no one. and these may constitute the totality of your beliefs. So his idea here is, I might be able to successfully refer to an individual even if none of the properties that I associate with that individual are had by that individual, nor are they had by anyone else. Suppose, Kripke continues, to vary the example about Gödel, that no one had discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. Perhaps the proof simply materialized by a random scattering of atoms on a piece of paper. The man called Gödel being lucky enough to have been present when the improbable event occurred. Further, suppose arithmetic is in fact complete, so the proof is actually wrong. One wouldn't really expect a random scattering of atoms to produce a correct proof. A subtle error known through the decades has still been unnoticed. So even if the conditions are not satisfied by a unique object, the name may still refer. And then he continues, I gave you the case of Jonah last week. Biblical scholars, as I said, think that Jonah really existed. It isn't because they think that someone ever was swallowed by a big fish or went to Nineveh to preach. These conditions may be true of no one whatsoever, and yet the name Jonah really has a referent. In the case above, Einstein's invention of the bomb, possibly no one really deserves to be called the inventor of the device. So the idea is 3 makes 2 false predictions. 3 makes a false prediction that when people say Einstein, if all they believe is that he was the inventor of the atomic bomb, they're not referring to the guy we typically think of as Einstein, but instead referring to whoever was the inventor of the bomb. Now, 4 is making a false prediction that is similar. It's saying when they use the name Einstein, not only are they not referring to the familiar guy, but if there is no single individual who invented the bomb, if it was, say, a collective, which it probably was, then the name simply fails to refer at all. But, says Kripke, no. If I say, I wonder whether, if I say Einstein was smart, and someone says, who's Einstein? And I say back, he invented the bomb, I've successfully said something true when I say Einstein was smart, even though the only description I associate with him, the one that fixes the reference, being the inventor of the bomb, is something that applies to not him, but rather no one. Okay, so we'll leave thesis 4 there, and we'll continue with 5 and 6 next time.